March 7, 1945. The town of Remagen, Germany. A cold mist clung to the Rhine River, turning its gray surface into a shifting mirror of smoke and fog. On the western bank, U.S. soldiers crouched behind shattered walls and burned-out vehicles, their faces streaked with soot and fatigue. For days, they'd been chasing the retreating German army eastward. But now, the river stood before them like a final, iron barrier. Captain Karl H. Timmerman of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion peered through his binoculars at the far side of the river. Beyond the haze loomed the Ludendorff Bridge, a steel colossus of girders and rivets, its twin towers rising above the Rhine like sentinels of another age. Against all odds, it was still standing. Timmerman couldn't quite believe it. Every intelligence report said the Germans would blow every bridge before the Allies reached the Rhine. But this single crucial link was intact. Somewhere across the river, German demolition teams were wiring explosives and waiting for orders. "Sir," a sergeant called out, his breath visible in the chill air. "We can see movement on the far side. Looks like engineers, maybe setting charges." Timmerman lowered the binoculars. "Then we move now," he said, "before they pull the trigger." Behind him, the engines of Sherman tanks rumbled to life, their exhaust blending with the river mist. The men of the 9th Armored Division had been fighting almost non-stop since crossing into Germany. They were tired, hungry, and cold, but the sight of that bridge sparked something in them. The Rhine was Hitler's last natural line of defense, and crossing it meant the heart of Germany lay open. As Timmerman's men advanced toward the town, artillery shells whistled overhead. German mortars began to fall, shaking the ground and splintering stone. But the Americans pressed forward, house to house, through the smoke and dust of Remagen's narrow streets. The closer they got, the more the bridge filled their vision, a gateway to victory and perhaps death. On the far side, German defenders of the 11th Panzer Division scrambled to organize a defense. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters shouted orders to his engineers, his voice hoarse. The bridge was rigged with explosives, but their detonator wires had been damaged by the constant shelling. "Fix the line," Peters yelled. "We can't let them take it." As U.S. tanks rolled into the open square near the western approach, the Germans detonated a preliminary charge. A deafening roar split the air. A section of the bridge erupted in smoke and sparks. But when the dust cleared, the main span still stood. Damaged, yes. Destroyed? Not even close. On the American side, disbelief turned into adrenaline. The bridge was crippled but alive, and that meant there was a chance. Timmerman seized his radio. "Get me engineers. We're taking it now." Within minutes, combat engineers from the 9th Armored Engineer Battalion were sprinting forward under fire. Bullets snapped around them as they darted onto the bridge deck. The steel grating groaned underfoot. Smoke stung their eyes, and the smell of burning oil filled their lungs. Everywhere, danger screamed. Sniper fire from the towers, mortars from across the river, the dull thud of artillery from the hills. But the engineers worked like men possessed, cutting wires, throwing explosives into the river, shouting over the chaos. The Germans tried again to ignite their remaining charges. A brilliant flash burst from the central span, sending a plume of water skyward. But again, the bridge held. The mighty Ludendorff refused to die. Timmerman didn't wait. "Go! Go now!" he shouted. Infantry squads poured across the bridge, running, ducking, firing as they went. Tanks thundered behind them, each one shaking the bridge's wounded frame. For the first time in the war, Allied troops were crossing the Rhine on a standing bridge, and the German command, watching from the east bank, could hardly comprehend what they were seeing. The impossible had happened. By nightfall, hundreds of American soldiers were across, holding a bridgehead on German soil. And as radio messages crackled back to headquarters, one phrase echoed from every channel: "We have the bridge at Remagen." By the morning of March 8, 1945, the impossible was no longer rumor, it was fact. American forces had secured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen and established a foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Word spread like wildfire through every Allied command post. Generals who had expected weeks of grueling river crossings suddenly found the door to the heart of Germany wide open. At the bridge, the air trembled with the roar of engines and the ceaseless hammering of artillery. Engineers worked frantically to strengthen the bridge while shells rained down from German guns hidden in the hills. Each detonation shook loose clouds of rust and dust from the bridge's iron skeleton. But still, men kept coming. Tanks, jeeps, and infantry columns moving across as if daring the enemy to stop them. Captain Timmerman, his face blackened with soot, stood amid the chaos directing traffic. "Keep it moving. One at a time, no stopping," he barked, waving forward a convoy of M4 Shermans. The bridge groaned under the weight but held firm. Beneath the steel decking, combat engineers tightened bolts, patched holes, and cut away live wires left by the Germans. Sergeant John Reynolds, one of the engineers, later recalled, "Every step you took, you expected the thing to go up. We could hear the steel creak like it was alive. But no one wanted to turn back. Not after coming this far." Across the river, German artillery officers of the 15th Army were in disbelief. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, slammed his fist against a map table. "They crossed the Rhine?" he demanded. "How is that possible?" His adjutant hesitated before answering. "Main Feldmarschall, the bridge did not collapse. They repaired it before our engineers could destroy it." In Berlin, the news reached Hitler himself. According to witnesses, his face turned pale with rage. The Rhine had been his final line, the ancient river he had vowed would never be crossed. To him, the loss of the bridge was not just a military failure, it was humiliation. Within hours, he ordered the arrest of every German officer involved in the defense of Remagen. Several would later face court-martial and execution, but the damage was already done. On the ground, the Americans were expanding their foothold. By nightfall on March 8th, more than 8,000 troops had crossed to the east bank. The engineers, though exhausted, began building pontoon bridges nearby to support the flood of reinforcements. The sky over Remagen burned red as tracer rounds cut through the darkness and searchlights raked the clouds. German counterattacks came in waves. Infantry, tanks, and even desperate Volkssturm units launched assaults against the bridgehead, only to be shredded by American artillery from the western hills. The Germans then turned to the air. On March 9th, swarms of Luftwaffe aircraft appeared, Me-262 jet fighters, FW-190s, and bomb-laden Arados diving through flak bursts. The bridge was their sole target. Anti-aircraft guns roared from both banks, filling the sky with steel. Bombs fell like rain, but luck and chaos favored the Americans. One bomb struck the riverbank. Another plunged harmlessly into the Rhine. The bridge, scarred but unbroken, still stood. The Germans grew desperate. V-2 rockets were fired from Holland, aimed squarely at the Remagen Bridge. One struck near the river, killing dozens of civilians and soldiers, but the bridge endured yet again. It was as if fate itself refused to let it fall. Meanwhile, engineers were performing miracles. They patched bullet holes with scrap steel, reinforced weak joints with timber and spare tank parts, and laid fresh planks to cover blasted sections. To any German officer watching from the opposite bank, it must have seemed like madness. The Americans building faster than the war could tear things down. By March 10th, the crossing was no longer a single thread of hope. It was a roaring artery of invasion. Armored divisions rolled eastward into the Rhineland, bypassing German strongholds and cutting off retreating units. Each truckload of soldiers crossing that bridge carried the same stunned realization. They had done what the world thought impossible. Still, beneath the triumph, a tension hung in the air. The sense that the bridge, battered and straining, could give way at any moment. It had taken bombs, rockets, artillery, and sabotage, yet somehow endured. But how long could even iron resist? The answer would come soon and at a terrible cost. March 14, 1945. Dawn broke over the Rhine in a pale, exhausted light. Smoke still curled from the ruins of Remagen. The river that once marked the line between two worlds now carried the sounds of engines, cranes, and men shouting orders over the roar of the current. The Ludendorff Bridge had become the lifeline of an army, and a target of an empire's desperation. Every hour, tanks, half-tracks, and endless convoys of supplies clattered across its battered frame. Engineers worked without sleep, their uniforms stiff with mud and oil, their hands raw from gripping steel that never stopped shaking. Lieutenant Hugh Mott, one of the officers overseeing the repairs, looked up at the web of beams above him. "She's done more work than any bridge ever built for war," he muttered. And he was right. What had once been a quiet railway crossing was now one of the most strategically vital points in all of Europe. German artillery fire had not ceased for a single day since the Americans captured it. The hills beyond Erpel flashed with muzzle bursts as heavy guns lobbed shells across the river. Each impact sent tremors through the bridge's foundations. Engineers reinforced the structure again and again, welding, bracing, patching. Every thud of boots and rumble of armor made the iron groan like an animal in pain. At the same time, U.S. engineers had completed a series of pontoon and Bailey bridges upstream, easing the burden. Yet still, the Ludendorff remained in constant use, a testament to Allied grit and an insult to German pride. The Germans didn't just shell it, they sent everything they had. On March 14th, jet-powered Me-262s screamed in at low altitude, their cannons spitting fire at the bridge deck. FW-190 fighter bombers followed, dropping 500-pound bombs that exploded so close the river seemed to leap from its bed. Anti-aircraft gunners from the 482nd AAA Battalion poured streams of tracer fire into the sky, bringing down plane after plane. But the attacks didn't stop. At one point, German frogmen, combat swimmers from the 361st Special Assault Battalion, tried to plant mines beneath the bridge. American patrol boats caught them in the moonlight and opened fire, leaving the river stained with oil and silence. And still the bridge held, day after day, hour after hour, until the afternoon of March 17th. The engineers had noticed new cracks forming in the bridge's steel trusses that morning. They tightened bolts and reinforced joints, but the structure had endured too much. It had been blasted, burned, and overloaded far beyond design. Every ton of steel seemed to cry out under the strain. At 3 p.m., Captain George W. Stott was standing near the center span when a sharp metallic groan echoed through the air, deep, drawn out, and unnatural. Soldiers froze. Someone shouted, "She's going!" The sound grew into a terrible shriek as rivets snapped and beams twisted. In the next instant, the center of the bridge folded like a wounded beast. The middle span dropped in slow motion, crashing into the river with a roar that shook the valley. Men on the deck were thrown into the water amid a storm of debris and black smoke. "Medic! Medic!" Voices screamed over the chaos. Lifeboats were launched. Ropes were thrown. Some men clung to the steel framework as it sank beneath them. Within minutes, the mighty Ludendorff Bridge, survivor of bombs, rockets, and fire, was gone. When the water finally stilled, a single twisted arch jutted above the Rhine like the bones of some fallen titan. 48 men were killed or wounded in the collapse. Engineers, infantrymen, and bridge guards who had risked everything to keep the crossing open. The river they had conquered had taken its toll at last. But their work had not been in vain. By the time the bridge fell, more than 25,000 American soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of vehicles had crossed into Germany. The Allies no longer needed the Ludendorff. Their foothold was secure, and their advance unstoppable. On the eastern bank, Colonel Glenn Anderson, commander of the engineers, stood silently watching the last curls of smoke rise from the water. "She did her duty," he said quietly, "more than anyone could ask." The bridge that shouldn't have survived a single day had lasted 10, under fire every hour. 10 days that changed the pace of the war and shattered German morale. The Ludendorff Bridge became more than a crossing. It became a symbol, a reminder that in war, courage and ingenuity can defy even the laws of steel and fate. German officers who had watched through binoculars from the hills later admitted they were stunned. Not by the destruction, but by the sheer audacity of the men who had built, fought, and died to keep that bridge standing. The Rhine had been crossed. The heart of Germany was open. And from that moment on, the countdown to the Third Reich's collapse had truly begun.